Welcome to Fluent Daily, the English listening channel for advanced learners at B2 and C1 level. Every episode features a rich, flowing conversation in natural English on a topic that is genuinely worth thinking about: history, psychology, science, philosophy, and more. There are no simplified sentences here, no slow speech, no vocabulary drills. Just real English spoken naturally on ideas that matter. This is Fluent Daily. Let's get into it.
Today we have a great story, so let's get started right now.
We have this universally accepted phrase, right? Like, you say it to comfort your friends after a bad breakup.
Oh yeah, or you say it to yourself in the mirror on a bad hair day.
Exactly. We just casually drop it into conversation all the time, to sort of smooth over disagreements. I'm talking about the phrase, beauty is in the eye of the beholder.
It's like the ultimate subjective defense, isn't it? It's just a very comforting thought to have.
It really is.
Really?
I mean, it implies this beautiful democratic idea that our aesthetic preference is just, well, it's a totally blank slate.
Right.
Like, you like what you like, I like what I like, and there's no objective right or wrong answer.
Right, exactly.
If you think that, I don't know, that weird avant-garde sculpture downtown is a masterpiece, and I think it looks like a literal pile of scrap metal, we're both perfectly valid in our subjective experience.
You're both right, essentially.
Right. But, and this is a big better, I've been digging into the research for today's deep dive, and honestly, my entire worldview on this has been shaken.
I am not surprised at all.
Like, what if we've been looking at this entirely backwards? What if the things you find beautiful, the faces you are just magnetically drawn to in a crowded room, the landscapes that literally take your breath away, what if literally none of that is actually a personal choice?
That is a deeply, deeply unsettling thought for a lot of people.
It is.
Because, we desperately want to believe our tastes belong to us alone. We want to think they reflect our unique individuality.
Yeah, like my taste is me.
Exactly. When we curate our homes or we pick our partners or choose our clothes, we think we are projecting our inner soul outward. But the data tells a vastly different, far more ancient story.
And that's exactly what we are going to unpack today. For everyone listening, we are pulling together evolutionary biology, cognitive psychology, behavioral economics, and some wild cutting-edge neuroscience to decode what is essentially a paradox.
The paradox of beauty.
Right. Why does something that feels so profoundly intimate to you actually turn out to be a highly calibrated biological scanner, heavily hardwired by millions of years of evolution?
I think we have to prepare everyone listening to have their assumptions thoroughly challenged.
Oh, for sure. Buckle up.
Because when you look under the hood of your own preferences, you quickly realize that your individual taste is it's largely a shared ancestral inheritance. You might think you have a type, but biology has a much bigger type that just completely overrides yours.
I am genuinely so excited and honestly a little intimidated to get into this because it changes how you see the world, literally. So let's start with that core tension. On one hand, beauty feels private.
Right.
But on the other hand, there is this massive, undeniable cross-cultural agreement on very specific visual stimuli.
And the consistency of that agreement is what first tipped researchers off that something deeper was going on here.
Because it wasn't always viewed this way. Right?
No, not at all. For decades, the prevailing assumption, especially in the humanities, was that culture dictated beauty. The idea was simply that society tells you what is attractive.
Like a top-down mandate from Hollywood or Vogue magazine?
Exactly. But then scientists started running global experiments. You can take individuals from completely different sides of the planet, from entirely different cultural backgrounds.
Like people who don't even share a continent.
Right. People who speak different languages, eat totally different foods, hold completely different values, and you show them a series of faces or even geometric shapes.
Okay.
When you ask them to rate the attractiveness of those images, their judgments align to a degree that completely statistically rules out pure cultural conditioning.
So it's not just Hollywood exporting a specific standard of, a leading man or leading lady.
No, the mathematical alignment goes way, way deeper than just media exposure. And the social consequences of this shared biological agreement are massive, which I know we are going to get into later.
Oh, we definitely are. The beauty premium stuff is wild.
It really is. But to truly understand why this happens, we need to look at it through the lens of three distinct scientific disciplines. They've all basically converged on this exact same phenomenon, but they started from entirely different directions.
I love when different fields of science accidentally stumble into the same room. What are the three angles we're looking from?
So first you have evolutionary psychology. This field doesn't look at beauty as an art form at all. It looks at it as an adaptive function.
Adaptive meaning like for survival.
Specifically, it views beauty as a critical mechanism for mate selection and survival. It asks the ultimate question, what is the biological utility of finding someone or something attractive? Why did nature bother to build that mechanism into us?
Okay, so that's the evolutionary why. What's the second discipline?
Second is cognitive psychology, specifically a subfield called psychophysics.
Psychophysics. That sounds intense.
It is. This is where scientists strip away all the emotion and look at the actual measurable physical properties of stimulus. They're looking at the geometry, the symmetry, the proportion, the raw mathematical complexity of the thing you are looking at.
So they're just measuring pixels and angles.
Pretty much. They want to know why certain mathematical arrangements reliably produce aesthetic pleasure in the human brain.
So if the first one is the why, this is the what, the actual raw data hitting our eyeballs.
Exactly. And finally, the third discipline is neuroscience. This is where we look at the physical wetware of the brain. Neuroscience maps out the exact neural correlates, the literal electrical reward circuitry that lights up when you encounter something you deem beautiful.
The neurological how. You know, it really makes me think about this whole system, like our sense of taste.
Oh, that's a good comparison.
Think about it for a second. We all have a personal favorite dessert, right?
Sure.
Maybe you love a rich, dark chocolate cake, and I am obsessed with like a bright, tart lemon bar. It feels incredibly personal to us. But underneath that specific, localized preference, you and I both share a fundamental biological craving for sugar and fat.
Right, because we need calories to survive.
Exactly. Evolution made sugar and fat taste amazing so we wouldn't starve. It sounds to me like beauty is essentially the visual equivalent of a sugar craving.
I think that's a brilliant way to frame it, actually. The specific flavor of beauty you prefer might be slightly tweaked by your environment or your memories or your culture.
The chocolate cake versus the lemon bar.
Exactly. But the underlying craving, the mechanism that makes you experience a literal hit of dopamine when you look at something specific, that is a universal biological imperative.
So if beauty is rooted in evolutionary biology, just like a craving for a high-calorie meal, what exactly is our brain craving when we look at another person?
Well,
like if I'm across the room at a party and I see someone and think, wow, they're stunning, what is my biological scanner actually looking for in that split second?
it is scanning for biological information. The evolutionary theory of physical attractiveness basically states that our aesthetic preferences are not arbitrary at all.
They aren't just random.
Not even a little. They aren't cultural constructions that someone just made up one day in Paris or Milan. They're highly sophisticated mechanisms for detecting health, genetic quality, developmental stability, and reproductive potential.
Okay, that sounds so clinical. So
Yeah.
you're saying when I'm checking someone out, my brain is secretly just reading their medical chart and their genetic profile.
In a sense, yes. What you experience subjectively as beauty is just the phenomenological correlate of adaptive mate assessment.
Okay, wow.
Now, obviously, you don't look at someone and consciously think, yes, this person has excellent developmental stability and exceptionally high pathogen resistance.
I mean, that would be a terrible pickup line.
It would fail spectacularly. You just think, wow, they are gorgeous. But that feeling of gorgeous, that flutter in your stomach, that inability to look away,
Yeah.
that is just your brain's way of rewarding you for identifying high-quality genes that would be advantageous to mix with your own.
Okay, let's break down the actual physical features we are assessing when we do this unconscious genetic audit. Because there are two massive universal correlates of facial attractiveness that just blew my mind in the research. Let's start with the first one, symmetry, facial symmetry.
A classic one.
This is the degree to which the left and right sides of your face are perfect mirror images of each other. Why is the human brain so utterly obsessed with the symmetrical face?
To understand the obsession with symmetry, you have to think about how a human being actually grows. Perfect symmetry is the biological blueprint. It's the ideal code.
Right.
But it is incredibly difficult to achieve in the chaotic real world. During development, from a tiny embryo in the womb all the way up to a full-grown adult, the body is constantly bombarded by stressors.
What kind of stressors are we talking about?
Pathogens, viruses, environmental toxins, minor genetic mutations, nutritional deficits. Even psychological stress that the mother might experience during pregnancy can be a stressor.
Okay, I'm picturing development as this massive years-long construction project. You are trying to build this perfectly balanced, beautifully engineered house, but while you're building it, a hurricane hits the site, or there's a supply chain shortage of lumber, or the foundation settles unevenly.
That is a phenomenal visual, yes. Every time one of those stressors hits the construction site of the human body, it introduces tiny errors.
Like a wall being slightly crooked.
Exactly. And those errors manifest physically as slight microscopic asymmetries. One eye sits just a millimeter higher than the other. The jawline is slightly sharper on the left side than the right. Or the cartilage in the nose develops a slight bend.
So if someone actually manages to have a perfectly symmetrical face,
it means their body was able to stay perfectly on the blueprint despite the hurricane. It is a massive signal of what biologists call developmental stability.
Developmental stability.
Yes. It basically means that person's immune system and genetic code were incredibly robust. They resisted all those incoming stressors and stayed perfectly on track.
So a symmetrical face is basically a biological receipt. It's a billboard that says, I survived the gauntlet of development without taking any structural damage.
That is exactly what it is. High facial symmetry indirectly signals exceptional genetic quality and disease resistance. And the data here is incredibly robust and, frankly, a little staggering.
What does the data show?
Well, research consistently finds that symmetrical faces are universally rated as more attractive. But it goes way beyond just ratings on a screen in a laboratory. Symmetrical men, for instance, have measurably better documented health records over their lifetimes.
Wait, really? It actually correlates to real-world, literal health.
It does. They get sick less often. And from a purely evolutionary standpoint, they report having more sexual partners, which is the biological endgame of mate selection, spreading those resilient, pathogen-resistant genes.
Wow. There's also this really fascinating behavioral shift in women regarding symmetry that I was reading about, something to do with cycles.
Oh, the fertility cycle data. Yes.
Yeah.
This is fascinating. Research has shown that women's preference for male facial symmetry actually fluctuates, and it peaks at peak fertility during their menstrual cycle.
Which is wild.
Yeah.
It means the biological scanner doesn't just run at a constant speed all month.
Right.
It gets even more sensitive, more demanding of genetic quality, right at the exact mathematical moment when conception is most likely.
It is a pattern perfectly consistent with the adaptive mate assessment hypothesis. You prioritize the absolute strongest genetic signals when the biological stakes for reproduction are the absolute highest.
That makes total evolutionary sense.
Now, it is worth noting that some recent replication studies have debated the exact magnitude of this menstrual shift, whether it's a huge shift or a subtle one, but the underlying drive for symmetry as a health indicator, that remains pretty much unquestioned.
Okay, so symmetry makes total sense to me. It's a health indicator. But the second major baseline rule of facial attractiveness, this one's a trip. Let's talk about averageness.
Yes, averageness.
And I want to be really clear for you listening.
Yep.
By averageness, we do not mean mediocre. We aren't talking about a solid C+ in the looks department. We are talking about the mathematical mean.
Right. Facial averageness is the degree to which a face resembles the mathematical average of the population it is drawn from. And I agree, initially, this feels deeply counterintuitive to most people.
Because culturally, we tend to think of beauty as something extraordinary, right? Something rare, something that really stands out from the crowd.
Exactly. But the physical data shows that the most attractive faces are not the most distinctive ones. They are actually the most average ones.
This was the biggest aha moment for me in all the source material. You're telling me being completely mathematically average is the secret to being wildly attractive. How does that even work practically?
It basically comes down to metric proportions.
No.
If you take a large population, say 1,000 people, and you measure all their facial features.
Like every single detail.
Right. The exact millimeter distance between the pupils, the length of the nose, the width of the cheekbones, the size of the forehead. If you then calculate the exact mathematical mean of all those measurements, the resulting theoretical face is incredibly undeniably attractive to human beings.
There's a classic experiment that proves this, right? The composite face studies, I want to try to visualize this because it makes it so clear.
Go for it.
Imagine you take 100 random photographs of faces. None of them are supermodels, just average people you'd see at the grocery store. Some have slightly crooked noses, some have slightly asymmetrical eyes, some have a strong jaw, some have a weak jaw.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
If you use software to digitally blend all 100 of those photos together, layering them on top of each other with slight opacity, that final single composite face will be rated as significantly more attractive than almost any of the individual 100 real faces that went into it.
It's a very famous effect in psychology. It works every time.
But why? Because to me, it's like by blending them all together, you are mathematically washing out all the individual flaws. You are erasing every minor asymmetry, every slight genetic quirk, every bump and blemish. And what you were left with is this perfectly smooth, perfectly balanced, generic ideal.
That generic ideal is what evolutionary biologists call the modal phenotype. It is the face closest to the population mean.
The modal phenotype. And why does the ancient part of our brain love the modal phenotype so much?
Because distinctiveness, sharp deviations from that average, often signal danger in the wild. Historically, wild deviations in facial structure indicate mutational, parasitic, or developmental perturbations.
So standing out too much biologically is essentially a giant red flag.
Biologically speaking, yes. If your facial proportions deviate wildly from the average, the primal scanner in the observer's brain thinks, uh-oh, this might indicate a genetic mutation or a severe developmental issue that occurred in utero.
Right.
So an average face signals the distinct absence of all those negative factors. It is a safe, proven, genetically stable bet. And nature loves a safe bet.
It's so funny because modern society pushes us so hard to be unique. We want unique fashion, unique personalities, unique lives. We dye our hair crazy colors to stand out.
We do?
But biologically, our brains are looking at faces and screaming, please just give me the most mathematically standard, unmutated average version of a human being possible.
It is the ultimate biological safety mechanism. Average equals healthy.
So we have symmetry and averageness as these foundational baseline rules for beauty. But let's add some nuance here because human beings aren't entirely gender-neutral, average-looking blobs, right?
Thankfully, no.
We have highly specific, highly gendered features. If averageness is universally appealing, how do we factor in these extreme masculine or feminine traits? Because, I mean, a giant square lumberjack jaw isn't exactly average.
That's the perfect question because it moves us from the baseline rules of symmetry and averageness into the realm of what evolutionary biologists call honest signals.
Honest signals.
Yes, and these signals are driven almost entirely by the endocrine system, specifically hormones like testosterone and estrogen.
Okay, honest signals.
Yeah.
I like that term. Why exactly do we call them honest? Are there dishonest signals?
We call them honest because they are incredibly metabolically expensive and extremely difficult to fake.
Meaning your body has to work really hard to make them?
Exactly. They are direct physical, structural consequences of the hormonal environment a person experienced during puberty and development. You cannot just will yourself into having a heavy brow ridge or a petite jaw.
You can't fake the biological receipts.
Precisely. Let's look at high testosterone in men, for example. A high testosterone environment during development causes very specific morphological changes to the skull.
Like what?
It leads to more prominent brow ridges, more pronounced jaw angles, a generally more angular, robust facial structure, and even secondary characteristics like a lower voice pitch and facial hair.
So basically the classic, rugged, hypermasculine look, like an action movie star.
Right. And from an evolutionary perspective, these features signal several critical things. High testosterone is strongly associated with immune competence, physical dominance, and overall genetic quality. In fact, there's a theory called the immunocompetence handicap hypothesis.
Wait, handicap? How is having a lot of testosterone a handicap?
Because testosterone is actually an immunosuppressant. It literally lowers your immune system's baseline defenses.
Really? I had no idea.
Yes. So the theory goes, if a male can survive and thrive while carrying a huge load of immunosuppressive testosterone, which is evident by his giant jaw and heavy brow, his underlying immune system must be absolutely incredibly strong to handle that handicap. It's like running a marathon with a 50-pound weighted vest.
Oh, wow. So the big jaw is saying, my immune system is so powerful I can afford to practically poison it with testosterone and still be perfectly healthy.
Exactly.
That is a massive biological flex.
It really is.
So, given all that, the theory should naturally assume that women universally prefer highly masculine male faces as mates, right? Because it signals a strong protector with bulletproof genes.
You would think so, but the research here introduces a lot of fascinating complexity. Women's preferences for masculine versus feminine male faces aren't static at all. They shift substantially based on context and specific mating goals.
What kind of goals are we talking about? Like having kids versus not?
Primarily, it's short-term versus long-term mating goals. Research shows that women tend to prefer slightly more feminine male faces, so softer jawlines, less prominent brows, rounder features, when they are evaluating a partner for a long-term relationship or marriage.
Wait, I'm confused. Why would they want a less masculine face for a long-term partner if the masculine face has the better immune system?
Because you are balancing genetic quality against behavioral traits. High testosterone, while signaling great genetic health, also strongly correlates with higher aggression, lower parental investment, and a higher statistical likelihood of infidelity and divorce.
Ah, I see. So the guy with the superhero jawline might have great genes to pass on, but he might also be more likely to start a bar fight and significantly less likely to stay home and help change diapers.
Exactly. Feminine features in a male face correlate with higher parental investment, more empathy, and lower aggression. So for long-term stability in child rearing, the preference naturally shifts toward those softer features.
That makes a lot of sense.
However, when evaluating for short-term mate quality, say, a brief fling, where the primary biological goal is securing high-quality genes without the need or expectation of long-term parenting investment, the preference shifts sharply back toward highly masculine faces.
That is just fascinating. The brain is constantly running these complex risk-reward calculations, playing the odds on parental investment versus genetic health, all based on a quick glance at someone's brow ridge.
It's a highly sophisticated biological calculus.
Okay, so that's testosterone and the immunocompetence handicap. Let's flip over and look at estrogen. What are the honest signals for female facial attractiveness?
Female attractiveness cues are also surprisingly consistent across cultures, which strongly points to evolved preferences rather than arbitrary societal standards. We are looking at things like clear, unblemished skin, large eyes relative to the size of the face, full lips, higher cheekbones, and a smaller, more delicate chin.
And all of these are tied back to estrogen.
The structural ones, yes. They reflect estrogen dominance during development. Just as testosterone creates a larger, heavier jaw, estrogen actively restricts bone growth in the lower face, which leads to a smaller chin and relatively higher cheekbones.
Interesting.
It also dictates fat distribution, moving it away from the waist and toward areas that create fuller lips and softer facial contours. These features are honest signals of high female reproductive condition.
Now, the clear skin makes obvious sense to me. That signals a strong immune system and a distinct absence of infectious disease or parasites. But I really want to zero in on the eye size thing, because when I read this, it completely blew my mind.
It's pretty incredible.
Large eyes relative to the face. Why is that universally biologically attractive?
Oh, this is one of my absolute favorite biological quirks in human anatomy. It is so elegantly simple, yet profound. The human eye does not grow in tandem with the rest of the skull after infancy.
Wait, let me make sure I understand this. Your eyeballs are basically the exact same size they were when you were a baby.
More or less, yes. The eyeball reaches its full adult size very, very early in childhood development.
Oh my God.
But the bones of the skull, the jaw, the forehead, the nose, the cheekbones, they continue to grow and expand massively throughout childhood, puberty, and adolescence. Therefore, the ratio of your eye size to your total face size is a literal biological timestamp.
That is incredible. I had no idea.
Think about a baby. They have massive eyes in this tiny little face. As you age, your face gets bigger and bigger, but your eyes basically stay the same size, so the mathematical ratio changes. The eyes appear smaller and smaller relative to the surrounding canvas of the face.
So large eyes relative to a small face undeniably indicate relative youth.
Precisely. By preferring large eyes, evolution is ensuring a baseline preference for youth, which correlates directly with peak reproductive potential and a longer window of fertility. It's a built-in biological clock that anyone can read instantly from across the room without even knowing they are doing it.
A literal timestamp on your face.
Yeah.
So we've got symmetry, averageness, testosterone markers, and estrogen markers. Now, these biological rules seem so rigid, so deeply hardwired into our DNA over millions of years.
They are very deeply ingrained.
But if we look around the real world, if we look at history, we know that beauty standards change. They change drastically over time, and they change across different societies. So where does culture step in and override this biological programming?
This brings us to a really crucial part of the research, and it's where a lot of the debate in the field happens. The cross-cultural data reveals a pattern of partial universality and partial cultural variation. It is a mixed account.
So it's not all biology.
No, beauty is both biologically grounded and culturally constructed. It's a canvas and paint situation. Biology provides the canvas, culture paints the specific picture on top of it.
Okay, let's look at the evidence for both sides, because I know there are skeptics out there. Starting with the universality. How do we know for sure that symmetry and averageness aren't just Western beauty standards exported through Hollywood movies, Instagram, and globalized media?
It's a very valid concern, and to prove the biological baseline, researchers had to find populations that were completely, entirely isolated from Western media, and they actually managed to do it.
Wow. Where?
They conducted studies on isolated traditional societies, indigenous groups of people who have had zero contact with globalized media, no magazines, no television, no smartphones, no internet.
How do you even conduct that study? Do you just walk into the jungle with a clipboard?
Usually anthropologists travel to these remote areas with physical photographs or simple laptop screens. They show the indigenous participants pictures of faces, some perfectly symmetrical, some asymmetrical, some mathematically average, some distinctive, and they ask them to rate or rank them based on attractiveness.
And what happens? Do their standards match ours?
They find substantial cross-cultural agreement. Even in these deeply isolated societies with totally different mating rituals and social structures, people still consistently prefer symmetrical faces, and they still prefer average faces.
So the media doesn't matter for the baseline.
Right. The cultural context of the rater doesn't seem to change the underlying biological preference for those specific mathematical properties. There was a massive meta-analysis conducted by Judith Langlois and her colleagues a while back.
What did she find?
They looked at a huge mountain of cross-cultural attractiveness research and found that agreement on beauty, both within a single culture and across vastly different cultures, was substantially, undeniably above chance.
So the biological baseline is always there, humming in the background.
Always.
But then we see massive cultural variations when we look at things like body type or weight. I was looking at the historical comparisons in the research, specifically contrasting Peter Paul Rubens' 17th century paintings with the modern Western ideal of beauty.
That is the textbook example of cultural variation. Look at a classic Rubens painting from the 1600s. The women celebrated as the absolute pinnacle of beauty. The muses of the era have heavier, much fuller bodies.
Right, very robust.
Contrast that with the contemporary Western ideal, which, especially over the last few decades, has historically skewed very, very thin. If beauty is purely biological and hardwired, how can the ideal body type completely flip upside down like that?
Right. If we are biologically hardwired to want one specific thing for survival, why did the 17th century aristocrat want a completely different body shape than a 21st century fashion editor?
Because certain beauty markers are what we call condition-dependent signals. The underlying biological drive is constant. We want to mate with access to resources. But the physical signal of having resources changes entirely depending on the local environment.
Ah, I see where this is going.
Think about it. In a historical environment where food is incredibly scarce, where starvation is a real, constant, seasonal threat, being heavy is a massive status symbol.
Because it means you have food.
Exactly. It means you are wealthy enough to afford abundant calories. It signals survival, prosperity, and the physical reserves necessary to carry a pregnancy through a famine. Therefore, heavier bodies are prized, admired, and viewed as beautiful.
But in modern Western societies, the environment is the exact opposite. Food is abundant. In fact, highly caloric processed food is often the cheapest and most readily available option.
Exactly. In an environment of caloric abundance, the signal for wealth and status completely flips. Being thin, particularly maintaining a very low body fat percentage while staying muscular or toned, requires immense time, energy, and resources.
Yeah, it's not easy.
It requires gym memberships, specialized organic diets, personal trainers, and the leisure time to work out instead of working a second job. So in a resource-abundant environment, thinness becomes the new signal of wealth and status.
That makes so much sense. The biological goal is exactly the same. Find the person with the most resources and the highest status. But culture and environment dictate what that status actually looks like physically. It's like money. The desire for wealth is constant, but whether you measure wealth in gold coins, paper dollars, or cryptocurrency just depends on the era you live in.
That is a phenomenal analogy. And we see this exact same condition-dependent flipping happen with skin tone, too.
Yes, let's talk about that. Because in many traditional and historical cultures, particularly in parts of Asia and pre-industrial Europe, there is a heavily documented preference for lighter skin. But this isn't a biological signal of fitness, is it?
No, it is entirely a reflection of social hierarchy and economics. Historically, lower-class individuals performed outdoor manual labor. They were farmers, builders, laborers, Because they worked outside all day, they naturally developed darker, sun-exposed skin.
Right.
The wealthy elite, the royalty and aristocracy, they stayed indoors. They didn't have to do manual labor, and therefore they retained very pale, lighter skin.
So the lighter skin was just a visual proxy for saying, I am rich enough that I don't have to work in the fields under the hot sun.
Exactly. It's a culturally constructed beauty standard based entirely on class hierarchy, not evolutionary genetic fitness.
But think about how this flipped in modern Western culture. It's the exact same mechanism, just completely inverted.
How so?
Well, a tan used to mean you were a poor field worker. But then the Industrial Revolution happens. The working class moves indoors into dark, cramped factories and offices. Suddenly, the rich people were the ones who had the time, the money, and the leisure to go outside, to travel, to take beach vacations to the Mediterranean or the Caribbean.
Oh, absolutely.
So by the mid-20th century, having a tan became the ultimate symbol of wealth and leisure. The biological canvas is the same. We desperately want to signal status. But culture paints a totally different meaning on it, depending on the century.
That's a perfect illustration of how cultural construction layers on top of the biological drive. The Langlois meta-analysis confirms this beautifully. Cross-cultural agreement is incredibly high for the deep biological stuff symmetry, averageness, the hormone markers.
But not for the rest.
Right. The agreement breaks down and becomes highly variable when you look at socially conditioned features like body weight ideals, skin tone, or specific stylistic choices like clothing, tattoos, or makeup.
Okay, so we've established what we define as beautiful and how our ancient biology and our modern culture team up to create these complex standards.
Yeah.
But here is where the conversation takes a real turn. What happens when we take these deeply ingrained, largely unconscious biological biases and we walk out of the dating pool?
Yeah.
And into the workplace or the courtroom.
Yeah.
Because we have to talk about the beauty premium.
This is where the research gets incredibly sobering and honestly pretty alarming. The social consequences of physical attractiveness extend so far beyond mate selection. It bleeds into almost every single facet of human interaction. The beauty premium is one of the most consistently replicated findings in all of behavioral economics and social psychology.
I was reading the work of Daniel Hammermesh, an economist who basically spent years crunching the numbers on this. What did he actually find?
Hammermesh analyzed the raw economics of physical attractiveness, looking at massive data sets, and his findings are stark. He found that, in the United States, more attractive workers earn approximately 10% to 15% more over their lifetimes than less attractive workers.
Let's just pause on that. 10 to 15%. If you are making $100,000 a year, an attractive person sitting next to you doing the exact same job is making $115,000.
Correct.
Over a 40-year career. That is hundreds of thousands of dollars. It is a staggering amount of money for what is essentially a genetic lottery ticket.
It is a massive economic advantage, and here is the critical part, the part that rules out other explanations. Hammermesh rigorously controlled for human capital variables. This premium exists across a wide range of occupations.
So not just actors or models.
Exactly. We are not just talking about jobs where appearance is obviously relevant to the product, like acting, television anchoring, or even high-end sales. We are talking about jobs where your face has zero bearing on your output. Accountants, software engineers, middle managers, data analysts.
So an attractive accountant is making 15% more than a less attractive accountant, even if their Excel spreadsheets are completely mathematically identical. Why? Why is an attractive face making a hiring manager or a boss think someone is better at math?
It's due to a deeply ingrained cognitive bias known as the halo effect. This was first documented by the psychologist Solomon Asch way back in the 1940s, and it remains one of the most powerful forces in human psychology.
I've heard the term thrown around in business seminars, but how does the halo effect actually work mechanically in the brain?
It is an unconscious mechanism of generalization. When you look at an attractive face, your brain instantly generates a positive affective response. It feels good to look at them. That positive feeling then automatically, without your permission, primes your brain to evaluate that person positively in other completely unrelated domains.
Oh, wow. So the glow of their good looks literally casts a halo over all their other personality traits.
Exactly. Because they look good, your brain unconsciously assumes they must also be more competent, more intelligent, more moral, more trustworthy, and just generally a better person. You evaluate their work better, independent of any actual observable evidence of their competence. You just give them the benefit of the doubt constantly.
And this bias spreads everywhere, doesn't it? It's not just salaries and corporate promotions.
It infects almost every system of evaluation we have built as a society. The halo effect has been thoroughly documented in academic grading, for example.
Wait, really?
Yes. Teachers unconsciously giving higher marks to attractive students for the exact same quality of essay. It affects political elections. Multiple studies show that more attractive candidates reliably receive more votes, even when voters claim they are voting strictly on policy.
That is terrifying.
It even affects medical treatment, with doctors occasionally providing more attentive, empathetic care to attractive patients.
It's the legal system that really chills me, though.
Yes, the legal sentencing data is deeply, deeply disturbing. Studies consistently show that for the exact same crime, with the exact same evidence, attractive defendants receive lighter sentences and lower bail amounts than unattractive defendants. Juries and judges unconsciously view them as more trustworthy or less likely to reoffend, purely based on their facial symmetry.
There's a wild flaw in our cognitive architecture, and it makes you realize how nearly impossible this is to police.
It is incredibly difficult.
If a company explicitly said, we pay people 15% less based on this arbitrary physical trait, HR would shut it down immediately, there would be lawsuits, it would be a huge scandal. But if this bias is entirely unconscious, if a judge or a hiring manager genuinely believes they are objectively evaluating the spreadsheet or the evidence, how do you possibly correct for it? You can't just pass a law banning a subconscious biological reflex.
That is the most difficult, intractable aspect of the beauty premium. Because it operates largely below the threshold of conscious awareness, it is stubbornly resistant to correction. You can train a hiring manager to ignore gender or race on a resume. You can even do blind resume screening.
Right.
But the second they sit down for an in-person or video interview, the halo effect triggers instantly. It happens in milliseconds before they've even asked the first question.
It really emphasizes how blindingly fast and powerful these biological systems are.
Yeah.
To understand why this bias is so automatic, so incredibly fast, and so unconscious, we have to literally look inside the brain when it sees something beautiful.
Yeah.
We need to leave the behavioral economics behind and look at the neuroscience.
Right. What actually happens in the physical biological architecture of your brain when you encounter a beautiful face or a stunning landscape or a magnificent piece of architecture?
Yeah, like where does beauty live in the brain? Is there a beauty center?
It's not confined to one single spot. The brain is much more networked than that, but there's a very consistent core of brain regions that reliably activate. The most prominent one is the medial orbitofrontal cortex, or MOFC.
The medial orbitofrontal cortex. That sounds very technical. What does that region actually do on a day-to-day basis?
This is a region deeply associated with reward processing and subjective value. It's the part of your brain that lights up when you eat a delicious meal, or win money, or experience physical pleasure.
Okay, the reward center.
Neuroscientists Samir Zeki and Tomohiro Ishizu did some fascinating neuroimaging work on this. They put people in fMRI machines and had them look at art and listen to music. They found that no matter what kind of beautiful stimulus you were looking at, a painting, a face, a building, this specific region, the MOFC, lights up. And even more importantly, its activation correlates directly in a graded linear fashion with how beautiful you rate the object.
So if I see a painting that is just, okay, there's a little bit of activity, but if I see a masterpiece that just completely blows me away, there's massive glowing activity in that region.
Exactly. It acts as a literal volume dial for beauty. And the profound takeaway here is that beauty is processed through the exact same reward circuitry that processes other fundamental sources of life pleasure and biological survival value. Beauty isn't just an abstract, intellectual, high-minded concept we invented in art school. It is a primary neurological reward.
It feels physically, chemically good to look at beautiful things.
It does. But it's not just a cold, calculating dopamine reward. The brain scans also highlight massive activation in the amygdala and the anterior insula.
And those are the emotion centers, right?
Yes. They are deeply, deeply associated with emotional processing, fear, and visceral feelings. This proves that an aesthetic experience is fundamentally an affective event. It is emotional. When you see a breathtaking sunset over the ocean, you don't just cognitively register, ah, yes, the light is refracting nicely off the water. You feel a swell of emotion. Your heart might literally beat a little faster.
Which perfectly explains why a piece of music or a movie can make us cry. It is plucking the exact same strings as real-world joy or grief.
Precisely. And there's one more network that lights up during aesthetic experiences that is incredibly revealing. It's called the default mode network.
I've actually heard of the default mode network, but usually in relation to meditation or daydreaming or when you're just staring at a window. What is it doing during an aesthetic experience?
So the default mode network is essentially the brain's self-referential processing system. It's the background hum of your consciousness. It's what is active when you are thinking about yourself, reflecting on your past, worrying about your future, or generating your sense of ego. Crucially, usually when you focus intensely on an external task, like reading a complex document or solving a math problem or playing a sport, this network shuts down. Your brain focuses outward.
Right. If I'm trying to parallel park in tight traffic, I'm not daydreaming about my childhood. My default mode network goes quiet.
Exactly. But here's the bizarre thing. During a profound aesthetic experience, when you are staring intensely at an external piece of art or a beautiful face, the default mode network does not shut down. It actually shows characteristic patterns of engagement. It stays active alongside the sensory cortex.
That is weird. Why would thinking about me activate when I'm looking at that?
It neurologically explains a very common, very profound psychological phenomenon. It explains why deep encounters with beauty, like standing in front of a masterpiece in a quiet museum or overlooking a vast canyon, make us feel deeply connected to ourselves, yet simultaneously able to transcend our ordinary, petty, day-to-day self-concerns. The art pulls you outward, but the default mode network turns that experience inward, making it feel deeply personal and meaningful to your own identity.
It triggers self-reflection, but elevates it. So we have this insanely complex dance happening in milliseconds between visual processing, reward, emotion, and self-reflection. I know neuroscientists try to map this out chronologically. There's a framework by Anjan Chatterjee, a neuroscientist at the University of Pennsylvania, that tries to make sense of all this firing circuitry.
Yes, Chatterjee's framework is brilliant because it captures both the involuntary biology we've been talking about and the conscious cultural influence we discussed earlier. He breaks the aesthetic experience down into a three-step model. Step 1 is early sensory processing. This is purely bottom-up.
Meaning from the eyeball directly to the brain.
Right. It is your visual cortex automatically, unconsciously analyzing the raw physical properties of the stimulus.
Yeah.
It's checking the shapes, the color contrast, the edges, the symmetry.
The raw data intake.
Exactly. Then, step 2 kicks in, recognition and meaning processing. This is top-down. This is where your cognitive interpretation and your memories step in. You recognize what the object is, you access your stored knowledge about it, you apply semantic context.
So step 1 is just seeing an arrangement of lines and colors. Step 2 is recognizing that the arrangement is a face, and specifically, the face of your favorite actor. Or recognizing that the messy painting on the wall is actually a Picasso.
Exactly. And then finally, step 3 is emotional and reward processing. This is the subjective valuation. This is the firing of the orbitofrontal cortex and the amygdala we just talked about. This is where you actually experience the pleasure, the awe, or the beauty.
This three-step model perfectly explains something I've always wondered about. I bet a lot of people listening have experienced this. Have you ever walked into a modern art museum, looked at some weird abstract paint, maybe it's just a giant red square on a blue background, and you feel absolutely nothing, just blank?
All the time.
But then you step closer and read the little informational plaque on the wall. You learn the tragic history of the artist. You understand the political context of why they chose those specific colors. You learn it was painted in a prison cell. And suddenly, you step back, look at the exact same painting, and you are moved to tears. It suddenly looks profoundly beautiful to you.
Yes. That is the perfect real-world example of Chatterjee's framework in action.
Because your early sensory processing step 1 didn't change at all. The literal paint on the canvas, the photons hitting your retina, are exactly the same. But your top-down knowledge step 2 drastically changed because you read the plaque. And because step 2 changed, it sent a completely different modified signal to step 3, literally changing the emotional and chemical reward you got from the painting.
It's amazing.
Learning about art actually physically changes how your brain sees it.
It is a beautiful synthesis of biology and culture. The bottom-up processing is ancient and automatic, but the top-down cognitive layers, our language, our history, our empathy, they can entirely modify the final neurological reward.
I want to zoom in on that very first step, though, before the history or the culture gets involved. That automatic early sensory processing, the raw data intake. Because the research suggests that the brain has a very specific preference for how that data comes in. What makes something easy for the brain's sensory cortex to digest? Why do certain shapes or patterns just feel inherently better to look at instantly?
This introduces one of the most theoretically productive concepts in the entire psychology of aesthetics. It is a concept called processing fluency.
Processing fluency. Fluency, like speaking a language fluidly.
Similar, yes. It is a measure of the ease with which a visual stimulus is cognitively processed by your neural pathways. Researchers like Rolf Reber, Norbert Schwartz, and Piotr Winkelmann proposed a very elegant, very powerful theory. The subjective experience of easy fluid processing is inherently pleasurable to the brain.
So the brain is basically lazy, and it likes it when things are easy.
Well, the brain is highly efficient. It consumes a massive amount of calories just to keep you alive, so it is always looking to save energy. When a visual task is effortless, when it doesn't require a lot of computational power, the brain rewards you with a tiny hit of positive affect, a little dopamine treat. Therefore, stimuli that are easy to process because they are familiar, symmetrical, high contrast, or prototypical are experienced as aesthetically pleasing simply because they require less cognitive friction.
There are some great everyday examples of this. The mere exposure effect is one that marketers use all the time, right?
Yes, the mere exposure effect is the incredibly well-documented finding that simply repeated exposure to a stimulus increases your liking for it. The more you see something, the more beautiful or appealing it seems.
Even if you don't consciously remember seeing it before. You can flash a shape on a screen for a millisecond, and later, a person will say they prefer that shape over others without knowing why.
Right. And processing fluency explains exactly why that happens. The very first time your brain processes a brand new face, a new logo, or a new song, it takes computational effort. The neural pathways are untrained. But the second time you see it, it's a little easier. By the 10th time, those neural pathways are heavily primed and lubricated. The processing is incredibly highly fluent.
Right.
And the brain misinterprets that ease of processing as aesthetic pleasure. Familiarity literally breeds liking because familiarity equals fluency.
This also perfectly explains why we love symmetry. We talked about symmetry way back at the beginning as a biological signal of immune health and developmental stability. But processing fluency gives us a pure, raw, computational neurological reason for it, too.
Yes, think about the geometry of symmetry. Symmetrical patterns activate bilateral mirror-symmetric neural responses in the visual cortex. It is computationally much, much easier for the brain to process a symmetrical shape than a chaotic, asymmetrical one. The brain essentially says, I only have to decode the left half of this face, and then I can just copy-paste and mirror it for the right half. Easy.
It saves processing power and rewards you with a feeling of beauty.
Exactly. It applies to everything, even something as simple as reading a book. Clear, readable, high-contrast typography is universally rated as aesthetically pleasing simply because your brain doesn't have to strain to decode the letters. Fluency is beautiful.
But wait, I have a bone to pick with this theory. If easy equals beautiful, wouldn't the most beautiful things in the world just be incredibly simple, boring shapes? Like a plain white circle on a black background is extremely easy to process. It has massive processing fluency. But I wouldn't stare at a white circle in an art museum for an hour. I'd be bored to tears.
And you've hit on the crucial caveat to the entire theory. The experts warn that maximum fluency does not equal maximum beauty. If a stimulus is too easy to process, it doesn't produce aesthetic pleasure. It produces profound boredom. The relationship between processing fluency and aesthetic pleasure is not a straight line going up forever. It is an inverted U-curve.
So the pleasure goes up as it gets easier, peaks, and then comes crashing back down if it's too easy.
Right. This is what we call the Goldilocks principle of aesthetic engagement. You don't want something too hard to process, like a completely chaotic, static-filled television screen, because that causes frustration and cognitive fatigue. Your brain gives up. But you don't want something too easy, like a plain white wall, because that causes boredom. The peak of the curve, the most positive, enduring aesthetic experience, happens at moderate fluency.
The sweet spot.
The sweet spot. It provides an optimal challenge level for the brain. It requires just enough cognitive engagement to be interesting, to keep the brain guessing and working, but not so much that it becomes a frustrating chore.
This makes so much sense, especially when you think about music. This perfectly explains the life cycle of a pop song. Think about a simple 4-chord pop song on the radio. It is designed for incredibly high fluency. Your brain can predict exactly where the melody is going, exactly when the chorus is going to drop on the very first listen. You love it immediately. It's catchy.
Oh, absolutely.
But because it is so fluent, so easy to process, you might get completely, utterly bored of it after a week of hearing it in your car. It slips down the far side of that inverted U into boredom.
That is a perfect example of rapid fluency leading to rapid boredom.
Meanwhile, think about a complex piece of jazz or a really dense classical symphony. The very first time you hear it, it has incredibly low fluency. It's hard to process. The time signatures are weird, the instruments are clashing, you can't predict the melody at all. You might not even like it initially. It might just sound like noise.
Right, it's frustrating.
But as you listen to it a few more times, as your brain slowly learns the underlying hidden patterns, the processing fluency slowly creeps up. And eventually, after 5 or 10 listens, it hits that Goldilocks zone of moderate fluency. It's challenging enough to stay continually interesting, but familiar enough to be deeply pleasurable. And you end up loving that piece of music for the rest of your life.
That is exactly how the brain manages aesthetic longevity. Moderate fluency sustains long-term engagement. It's why we can look at certain complex paintings or listen to certain albums for decades and still find new things to appreciate.
We've broken down so much here today. We started with the evolutionary biology of mate selection, the immunocompetence of a heavy jaw. We looked at the cultural conditioning of environment and hierarchy, like why a tan became a status symbol. We literally looked at the brain scans of the orbitofrontal cortex and the cognitive physics of processing fluency. We know how beauty works on a mechanical level, but to truly appreciate it as human beings, we need the right words to describe the different ways it hits us.
This is a really important final layer to the conversation. Having the right vocabulary doesn't just allow for more precise communication with others. It actually allows for a better understanding and processing of our own internal neural responses.
Because language matters.
It does. The English lexicon regarding aesthetics is incredibly nuanced if we bother to use it. We don't just have the word beautiful. We have elegance, we have grace, we have ugliness, we have the grotesque, and most importantly, we have the sublime.
The beautiful versus the sublime. This is a distinction that goes way back in philosophy. We're talking about thinkers like Edmund Burke in 1757 and later Immanuel Kant. How did they divide these two concepts, and does it map onto what we know now about the brain?
It maps on beautifully, pun intended. They recognized hundreds of years before fMRI machines that not all profound aesthetic experiences are just variations of pretty. They codified a very real psychological and neurological distinction. The beautiful, in the classical sense, is an object or experience that produces pleasure through harmony, proportion, symmetry, and general pleasantness. It makes you feel calm, rewarded, and safe.
An example would be a sunset over a perfectly calm sea. The colors are warm, the horizon is balanced, it's highly fluent, it is classically beautiful.
Exactly, you feel at peace. But the sublime is a completely different neurological and emotional event. The sublime produces a highly complex, almost overwhelming mixture of pleasure, awe, fear, and admiration. It is triggered by immense scale, immense power, or incomprehensibility.
So instead of the calm, pretty sunset, the sublime is a massive, violent, towering hurricane at sea.
Right. Or standing right at the precipice of the Grand Canyon, feeling how tiny you are. Or looking at those deep field images of thousands of galaxies from the James Webb Telescope, where the scale of the universe literally breaks your brain's ability to comprehend it. It is aesthetically profound, you can't look away, but it doesn't make you feel safe or calm. It makes you feel tiny, terrified, and awestruck all at once. The distinction between the beautiful and the sublime maps perfectly onto different emotional arousal states in the amygdala.
If we connect this back to the bigger picture, specifically to Anjan Chatterjee's 3-part neuroscience framework we discussed earlier, having this specific philosophical vocabulary actually feeds back into the neurological loop, doesn't it?
How do you mean?
Well, the words we use belong to step 2. Our top-down cognitive interpretation and semantic meaning. If you are standing in front of a raging ocean in a storm, and the only word you have in your vocabulary to describe aesthetics is beautiful, your brain might be confused. The visual input is chaotic, dark, and terrifying, which completely contradicts the harmony and safety of beautiful.
Right.
But if you have the concept of the sublime in your vocabulary, your top-down processing can instantly categorize the chaos, the awe, and the fear as a valid, positive aesthetic category. Having the word changes how your cognitive interpretation works, which in turn smooths out and enhances the emotional reward you experience in step 3.
Yeah.
You can actually enjoy the terror of the storm because you have a linguistic framework that turns it into art.
That is a phenomenal synthesis. Yes, the language we possess actively shapes the aesthetic rewards our brains are capable of unlocking. It's almost a form of cognitive behavioral therapy for art.
It is incredible how deeply intertwined our language, our culture, and our ancient biology really are. You just can't separate them.
No, you can't.
We've covered immense ground today. We've learned that our brains are ancient, highly calibrated biological scanners, constantly seeking out mathematical averageness, developmental symmetry, and processing fluency to ensure genetic survival. We've seen how our desire for status allows culture and environment to overwrite those biological baselines. And we've seen how the halo effect unjustly rewards the people who happen to win this genetic geometric lottery.
It's a lot to process.
It is. But as we wrap up, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final, slightly provocative thought to mull over. Think about the world we are stepping into right now. We are entering the era of AI-generated images, deepfakes, and hyper-filtered social media.
Oh, wow.
Artificial intelligence is currently flooding our screens with mathematically perfect, hypersymmetrical, flawlessly average faces. AI doesn't have developmental stressors. It didn't have to survive a biological hurricane in utero. It doesn't have asymmetrical quirks or minor genetic mutations. It just generates the pure, concentrated, mathematical modal phenotype we talked about.
It's pure processing fluency.
Exactly. So if our evolutionary beauty standard is deeply influenced by the mere exposure effect, the idea that what we see most frequently becomes our fluent baseline standard for beauty. What happens to human attraction when we are constantly exposed to flawless AI? If our brains get used to processing absolute, effortless mathematical perfection all day on our phones, will real, slightly asymmetrical, naturally flawed human faces eventually become difficult to process?
That is a scary thought.
Will real human faces slip out of that Goldilocks zone of processing fluency and actually become aesthetically unpleasing to us? Are we technologically engineering an environment where genuine human biology can no longer compete with the artificial beauty standards we've created?
I mean, that is the big question going forward.
Just some food for thought the next time you're endlessly scrolling. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope this challenged your assumptions and gave you a totally new lens through which to view the world and yourself. Step outside today, look around, and actively search for the underlying geometry of the things you love. See if you can spot the difference between the classically beautiful and the overwhelmingly sublime in your everyday life. We will catch you on the next one.